So I'd like to start off today by asking a seemingly ridiculous question. You ready? Do you have to be Jewish in order to be Christian? I mean, that seems like a really screwball question to our ears, because it would never occur to most people that you would have to be Jewish to be Christian. Heck, if you asked a random person on the street, there's a good chance that they would question whether or not a person could be both Jewish and Christian. But in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' death, that wasn't the case. Jesus was Jewish. His first followers were all Jewish. He had been active in Israel, following the God of Israel, preaching from the scriptures of Israel. And Christianity looked in those early days, for all intents and purposes, like just one of several sects of Judaism, like the Pharisees or the Essenes or the Sadducees. So when people in Jerusalem started hearing that Gentiles had accepted Christ, they were, perhaps understandably, confused. And more than that, they were critical of Peter for eating with these people. I mean, okay, we've come to terms with following a guy who ate with tax collectors and sinners, but at the end of the day, those were still Jews. You're breaking bread with Gentiles? I mean, do you know what those people eat? Now, this controversy was actually settled fairly quickly. Peter told them of a vision where God had told him not to make any distinction between Jews and Gentiles. And then, the real kicker, God bestowed upon the Gentiles the Holy Spirit. And that ended the debate, and the Gentiles were in. If God had accepted them, how could the church reject them? But the devil's in the details, right? I mean, the question of whether or not they could follow Jesus had been settled, but there was this follow-up question that proved a lot more tricky. Did following Jesus mean obeying the Mosaic law? I mean, after all, Jesus had lived by the Mosaic law, and they were supposed to emulate him, right? And he had said that not one stroke of a letter would disappear from the law until all had been accomplished. And I mean, didn't it just make sense that if the law represented how God wanted his people to live, that we should all try to live that way? I think sometimes it's easy for us to look back with the benefit of 2,000 years of hindsight and reflection and, an actual completed New Testament and say, no, they were clearly wrong, right? But we have to realize that at the time, this was not an easy question. They argued about this for over a decade. And both sides had pretty good reasons to think that they were right, with the stakes being framed as nothing less than salvation itself. So finally, in Acts 15, they gathered everyone in Jerusalem to just kind of hash this thing out. And the Pharisees had their say because, yes, a lot of the early followers of Jesus were Pharisees. And Paul had his say. Peter chimed in, and the debate dragged on. Now, the sides actually had a lot more in common than we might give them credit for. It's kind of the nature of controversy that it tends to hide just how much we agree on. They all actually agreed that we are saved by faith in Jesus, not by merit. And that might surprise you, but it's true. It's right there in verse 11. The Pharisees were not saying that we earn salvation. They were saying that the saved should do their best to keep God's law. And everyone also agreed that the Gentiles were part of the church. They had received the Holy Spirit. That had been settled back in Acts 11. And they agreed that no one, apart from Jesus, had ever kept the law perfectly. Even the Pharisees agreed to all of that. But they also agreed that faith and the power of the Holy Spirit would change the way that people lived. You couldn't accept Jesus and still worship pagan gods, or visit prostitutes, or go around killing people. Just because we're not saved by works doesn't mean that we can feel free to engage in sins as we follow Jesus. Even Paul acknowledged all of that. So given all of that overlap, James, the brother of Jesus and leader of the Jerusalem church, finally proposed a solution. Before we get into that, however, I should mention that there is a little bit of debate here. You see, Acts is notorious for having pretty drastic differences between different manuscripts. Some of these manuscripts differ in length by as much as 10%. That's about 3 whole chapters of material. And if you pick up a textual commentary on the New Testament, which is a type of commentary that focuses on these differences between manuscripts, you'll find that roughly a third of the book is dedicated just to Acts. Now, that could be because it was viewed as more of a history of the church, which was very much ongoing. And so people might have felt more free to add to it or revise things than they would have with something like the Gospels. But whatever the reason, there are a lot of variations. And when you come to this passage, the Apostolic Decree, you actually have 3 major versions. Some of the manuscripts list 3 prohibitions. Abstain from things polluted by idols, from things that have been strangled, and from blood. This is what you might call kosher light. It doesn't mention things like shellfish or pork, but it has some of the dietary restrictions that the Jews followed. Other manuscripts had 3 prohibitions, but a different set. Abstain from the pollution of idols, from fornication, and from bloodshed. Now, the Greek word here for blood and bloodshed are actually the same word. Meaning kind of depends on context. And in that first version, where it's clearly about dietary restrictions, it would refer to meat that still had the blood in it. While in the second list, which is clearly about general codes of behavior, it's equally clearly about bloodshed, about killing. And then there are some manuscripts that try and make everyone happy. They include all 4 prohibitions: the pollution of idols, that which is strangled, fornication, and blood or bloodshed. And finally, some, but not all manuscripts add and do not do to others what is hateful to yourself. The golden rule. Now, without getting too far into the weeds on this, I'll say that all of these versions had groups of scholars that support them as being the original text. However, I am far and away most convinced by the second version. And I'll tell you why. The first version just doesn't make sense to me, all right, given what the church was discussing. It would have represented a compromise that would have been anathema to literally everyone who was involved in the conversation. I mean, to Paul, the problem wasn't that the list of commands in the law was too long. It's that people were trying to achieve righteousness through the law. Saying, well, you can eat shellfish and pork, but not things that were strangled or meat with the blood in it. That's not going to address his concerns in the least. And his opponents, who were insisting that the Gentiles needed to follow the law of Moses, do you think that these 3 dietary restrictions would placate them? Not a chance. Also, there are only a few manuscripts that support this reading. The only notable one being P45 from the Alexandrian family of texts, and a few other witnesses like Origen who copied from the Alexandrian manuscripts. But that second version, the one that says Gentiles should avoid idolatry, fornication, and bloodshed, now that's a list that Paul is constantly admonishing people on. And it makes perfect sense, not only of Paul's position, but of the statements that Peter and James make in this chapter as well. And it also makes sense of the fact that Paul later referenced this decision in his letter to the Galatians to support his position that the Gentiles don't need to be circumcised or follow kosher law. Also, it helps that it happens to be attested to by the entire family of manuscripts known as the Western texts. Now, the third option to me seems like a scribe had 2 different manuscripts that didn't agree and so decided to harmonize them. 2 lists with 4 prohibitions between them, so 4 prohibitions. That's the form that the Byzantine family of texts and some Alexandrian texts take. And it's honestly a sort of compromise that really just muddies the water. So the case for that second version seems pretty solid to me. And so I'm going to proceed from that reading. So the question of what portions of the law apply to the Gentiles under the new covenant. James proposes that they be taught to refrain from idolatry, fornication, and bloodshed. And after years of bickering and days of arguing, this proposal was adopted unanimously by the Jerusalem Council. And I find it fascinating that the text goes out of its way twice in verses 22 and 25 to point out that this was a unanimous decision. So, circumcision, dietary restrictions, clothing codes, festivals, those sorts of things were part of the Mosaic covenant, but only the prohibitions against idolatry, fornication, and bloodshed held sway under the new covenant. Also worth noting is that the churches are not called on to enforce the punishments that the Old Testament called for. People are to be instructed to refrain from these things, but the punishment for sin was paid for by Christ. Now, this has pretty huge implications for how we read the Old Testament. I mean, people sometimes ask me why some of the prohibitions in the Old Testament are followed, while things like eating shellfish are ignored. Well, this is why, or at least one of the reasons. But in addition to how it informs our view of the Old Testament, it shows a model of decision-making that we really should aspire to. There was a time when the church, confronted with the most divisive topic of its day, managed to come to a unanimous decision on how to move forward together. And that strikes me as nothing shy of a miracle. Thanks be to God.